Virgin Mountain Man meets too old bride at the train station. He married her that day. The dusty whistle of a train cuts through the Colorado mountains. A silent mountain man waits for his freight. But instead, off steps a woman the town mocks as too old for any man. Jeers rise, boots scuff the dirt, and the church bell tolls like a warning. Then, before anyone can laugh again, he speaks. In front of the whole town, the loneliest man on the frontier claims her as his bride. That very day. But this sudden marriage hides a truth the crowd never saw coming. She carries with her 2 children, children the town swears don't belong, and a powerful rancher will stop at nothing to tear this new family apart. Thundering hooves, jailhouse keys, the slam of a cabin door. What began at the train station is about to shake the entire valley. Will this unlikely couple stand against greed, prejudice, and the cold bite of winter? Or will the frontier swallow their fragile hope before it ever has a chance to grow? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of Colorado's Silver Creek Station. Daniel Boone shifted his considerable weight from one boot to another, trying to make himself smaller despite his towering frame. The supply list in his rough hands gave him something to focus on, besides the whispers that followed him everywhere in town. "There's that Boone fellow again," came a woman's voice, hardly bothering to lower her tone. "Living up in them hills all alone like a bear." Daniel kept his eyes on his paper, though the words blurred together. His calloused thumb traced the edge of the sheet, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of enduring such talk. The general store's order was simple enough: coffee, flour, salt pork, but he found himself reading it over and over, anything to avoid meeting the curious stares. "Never did take himself a wife," another voice added. "Reckon there's something wrong with him?" The station master's bell clanged, cutting through the gossip. "Train's coming," he called out, and sure enough, the distant whistle pierced the crisp mountain air. Daniel tucked the list into his coat pocket, grateful for the distraction. The locomotive's approach drew everyone's attention away from him as it rolled into the station, belching steam that crystallized in the cold. Among the passengers stepping down onto the platform was a woman Daniel had never seen before. She wasn't young, perhaps 40 or so, with streaks of silver in her dark hair pulled back severely from her face. Plain but dignified in her simple black dress, she clutched a Bible close to her chest like a shield. Something in her bearing spoke of both strength and vulnerability that made Daniel's heart twist unexpectedly. "Well, if it ain't another mail-order bride," sneered Tom Wilson from the feed store. "Bit long in the tooth for that, ain't she?" Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Daniel watched as the woman's shoulders stiffened, but she held her chin high, though her knuckles whitened around her Bible. "Waste of train fare," someone called out. "No man's gonna want—" "I will!" The words left Daniel's mouth before he'd even realized he was speaking. His own voice sounded strange to his ears, deeper and steadier than he'd expected. "If no man will have her, I will. I'll marry her this day." The station fell silent as a graveyard. The woman, he didn't even know her name yet, stared at him with wide eyes, her lips parted in surprise. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs, but something deep in his soul told him this was right, this was meant to be. "Ma'am," he said, taking a step toward her. His voice grew softer, meant for her. Alone though the entire station strained to hear. "I ain't much for talking, and I know this is sudden-like. But if you're willing, I'd be honored to make you my wife." She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "I'm Kim Hensley," she said finally, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "And you are?" "Daniel Boone, ma'am. I've got a small place up in the hills. It ain't much, but it's honest, and you'd be welcome there." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "You don't know anything about me, mister." Boone. "I know you've got courage," he replied, standing tall despite their cruel words. "I know you carry the good book close, so you've got faith. That's enough for me to build on if you're willing." Reverend Matthews stepped forward from the crowd, his expression thoughtful. "I could perform the ceremony right here in the station house," he offered, "if that's what you both want." Kim's fingers traced the worn leather of her Bible. "You're certain about this, Mr. Boone? You'd tie yourself to a stranger just like that?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "Some things a man just knows in his heart, Mrs. Hensley. I ain't never been more certain of anything." She drew a deep breath, then nodded once, decisive. "Then yes, I accept." The station house's pot-bellied stove cast flickering shadows on the walls as Reverend Matthews opened his Bible. The curious townsfolk gathered around, their earlier mockery forgotten in the face of such an unexpected turn of events. Daniel and Kim stood before the preacher, their shapes thrown large against the wall by the lamplight. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice carrying in the hushed room, "we are gathered here in the sight of God." Daniel's hands were steady as he spoke his vows, though his voice was rough with emotion. Kim's responses came clear and sure, her dignity transforming the impromptu ceremony into something sacred. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Daniel carefully slipped his mother's ring, carried in his pocket these many years, onto Kim's finger. The winter dusk was settling over the mountains as they stepped out of the station house together. Snow was beginning to fall, soft flakes catching in Kim's hair. Daniel helped her into his wagon with careful hands, then climbed up beside her. As they drove away from the station, the lamplight fading behind them, Daniel felt a peculiar peace settle over him. He couldn't explain the certainty that had seized him, but in his heart, he knew. This was God's doing, plain and simple. Kim sat straight beside him, her Bible in her lap and her hands folded atop it. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but full of unspoken questions and possibilities. As the wagon carried them toward their shared future, the snow fell harder, wrapping them in a world. That seemed to contain only the two of them, their breath visible in the gathering dark. At last, Kim spoke softly. "Thank you, Mr. Boone, Daniel, for what you did back there." "No need for thanks between husband and wife," he replied, then added gently, "And it's just Daniel now." She nodded, and they fell back into companionable silence as the wagon wound its way up into the hills, toward the place that would now be their home together. The station house door creaked open as Daniel and Kim stepped out into the crisp evening air. Behind them, the murmurs of townsfolk followed like autumn leaves scattered by the wind. Daniel's broad shoulders tensed at the whispers, but he kept his focus on his new bride, studying her face in the fading light. "Ma'am, Kim," he corrected himself, his voice low and gentle. "My horse is just yonder. Would you care to ride while I walk alongside?" "The diner's a fair piece down the street." Kim glanced at the tall bay horse, its coat gleaming in the lamplight. "I wouldn't want to put you out." "No putting out about it," Daniel said, already moving to adjust the stirrups. His large hands worked with surprising delicacy at the leather straps. "Evening's getting cold, and you've had a long journey." The townsfolk gathered on the station platform watched as Daniel helped Kim mount, his massive hands spanning her waist as he lifted her with careful strength. She settled herself side saddle, arranging her skirts with dignity despite the curious onlookers. Daniel gathered the reins in one hand and began leading the horse down the street, his strides measured to match the horse's peaceful walk. The Silver Creek Diner's windows glowed warm against the deepening twilight. More whispers followed them as Daniel helped Kim dismount, then tied his horse to the hitching post. The bell above the door announced their entrance, and conversation stuttered to a halt as heads turned to stare at the unlikely pair. "Evening, Ms. Ruby," Daniel nodded to the stout woman behind the counter. Table for two, if you please." Ruby's eyebrows rose, but she grabbed 2 menus and led them to a corner table. "Coffee'll be right out," she said, her tone carefully neutral. The lamplight cast soft shadows across the checked tablecloth as Daniel and Kim sat across from each other. Daniel's large frame made the wooden chair seem small, yet he handled his menu with gentle care, as though afraid of tearing the worn pages. "The beef stew's good here," he offered after a moment of awkward silence. "Fresh bread, too." Kim nodded, her fingers tracing the menu's edge. "That sounds lovely, thank you." Ruby returned with their coffee, and Daniel waited until Kim had doctored hers to her liking before taking a sip of his own. His quiet courtesy didn't go unnoticed. Kim's shoulders relaxed slightly as the meal progressed, though she remained acutely aware of the sidelong glances from other diners. Daniel kept his movements deliberate and smooth, as though trying not to startle a wild creature. He broke the fresh bread and offered her the first piece, waited for her to begin eating before starting his own meal. When Kim's spoon clinked against her empty bowl, he signaled Ruby for the check. Outside, the temperature had dropped further, and Daniel quickly moved to help Kim with her shawl. But as they approached his horse, Kim suddenly stopped, her hand flying to her throat. A tremor ran through her frame. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's something I need to tell you." He turned to face her fully, his expression open and attentive. The lamplight from the diner's windows caught the silver threading through Kim's dark hair as she gathered her courage. My grandchildren," she managed finally. "They're arriving on tomorrow's train." "I never mentioned them in my correspondence. I was afraid." Her voice faltered. "No man wants to take on another man's children, let alone grandchildren. I thought if I could just get here, find work somehow." Daniel stood as still as the mountains themselves, absorbing her words. The only movement was the steam of his breath in the cold air and the slight shifting of his weight as he processed this revelation. "How many?" he asked quietly. "2, Kim replied, her hands clutching her shawl tighter. "Sarah is 10, and Thomas is 8. Their mother, my daughter-in-law, she—" Kim's voice caught. "There was fever last winter. My son passed 5 years ago. They have no one else." Daniel's silence stretched long enough that Kim's eyes began to fill with tears. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady as ever. "Children need looking after," he said simply. "Can't fault you for protecting your own. We'll meet them at the station tomorrow." Kim stared at him, hardly daring to believe. "Just like that? You'd take on such a burden?" "Made my vows not 2 hours ago," Daniel replied, his rough hand gentle as he touched her elbow. "Meant every word of them. Your family's my family now, if you'll have us." A sob caught in Kim's throat, quickly stifled. Daniel pretended not to notice, giving her a moment to compose herself as he adjusted his horse's bridle. "The boarding house is just down the street," he said after a while. "Ms. Thompson keeps clean rooms. I'll see you settled there for the night. Make sure you're comfortable." "You're not—" Kim hesitated. "Where will you stay?" "Got my cabin up in the hills," Daniel explained. "It ain't fit for a lady yet, needs some working on. I'll meet you here at dawn, if that suits you. We can get things ready for the little ones." The walk to the boarding house was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Daniel spoke briefly with Mrs. Thompson, pressing coins into her hand for a room. He waited until Kim was safely inside before tipping his hat and turning toward home. The ride to his cabin was long and cold, but Daniel hardly noticed. His mind was too full of the day's events, of the magnitude of what he'd taken on. The cabin's dark windows greeted him like empty eyes, and he moved through the familiar motions of lighting the lamp and starting a fire with practiced hands. Kneeling beside his narrow bed, Daniel bowed his head. The lamplight threw his shadow large against the rough-hewn walls as he struggled to find the right words to pray. "Lord," he whispered finally, "don't rightly know what you've got planned here. Never figured myself for a family man, Don't know the first thing about being a husband, let alone a grandfather." He paused, his large hands clasped tight. "But if this is your doing, and I reckon it must be, I'm asking for wisdom. Strength, too. Them children deserve better than what life's handed them so far." The cabin's familiar creaks and settling sounds offered no answers. Daniel lay down fully clothed atop his quilt, staring at the ceiling's shadowed beams. Sleep proved elusive as his mind turned over and over the challenges ahead. The cabin's sparse furnishings, the need for proper beds, the 100 things children might require. Across town in the boarding house, Kim sat at a small desk, her Bible open before her. Her fingers traced the familiar words of Psalm 27. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" She thought of Daniel's steady presence, his quiet acceptance of her burdens. Perhaps, she reflected, the Lord worked in ways more mysterious than she'd imagined. The night stretched long for both of them, each wondering what God's plan might be, each seeking courage for the dawn to come. The morning frost glittered like scattered diamonds across the train platform as Daniel guided his wagon to a halt outside the station. The sun had barely crested the eastern mountains, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. His breath clouded in the crisp air as he helped Kim down from the wagon seat, her hands trembling slightly beneath his steady grip. Already, a small crowd had gathered near the freight office, ranchers and merchants awaiting their shipments. Their conversations dimmed to whispers as Daniel and Kim made their way to a bench near the tracks. Kim clutched her Bible close, her knuckles white against the worn leather cover. "Train's running on time today," Daniel said quietly, checking his pocket watch. The timepiece had been his father's, its silver case dulled with age, but its hands still marking the minutes faithfully. Kim nodded, too nervous to speak. Her eyes remained fixed on the western curve of track where the train would appear. Daniel stood beside her like a sentinel, his broad shoulders squared against the morning chill and the weight of curious stares. The distant whistle echoed off the mountainsides, growing louder as the locomotive approached. Steam billowed white against the blue sky as the train rounded the bend, its wheels grinding against the rails. Kim rose to her feet, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. The passenger car doors opened, and travelers began descending onto the platform. Through the thinning steam emerged two small figures, clinging to each other as they carefully navigated the steep steps. Sarah, at 9 years old, held her brother's hand tight, her dark hair gleaming in the morning sun. 7-year-old Thomas pressed close to his sister's side, his eyes wide and wary as they searched the crowd. "Grandmother," Sarah called out, spotting Kim. The children rushed forward, wrapping their arms around her waist as she enveloped them in an embrace. Their reunion drew more attention from the growing crowd, and the whispers grew louder, more pointed. Daniel hung back a respectful distance, watching as Kim wiped tears from her cheeks and smoothed the children's travel-wrinkled clothes. Both children bore the clear features of their mixed heritage, their father's Apache coloring blessed with their mother's lighter eyes. Beautiful children, Daniel thought, though he could see how their appearance sparked judgment in the onlookers' faces. Slowly, he approached the small family group, dropping to one knee to bring himself closer to the children's level. "Morning," he said softly. "I'm Daniel. Your grandmother and I were married yesterday." Sarah regarded him solemnly, still holding her brother's hand. Thomas half hid behind his sister, studying Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You're awful big," Thomas ventured after a moment, earning a gentle squeeze from his grandmother. A hint of a smile touched Daniel's weathered face. "Reckon I am at that. Helps with carrying heavy things, though, like your trunks there." He nodded towards their luggage on the platform. The relative peace of the moment shattered as a harsh voice cut through the morning air. "Well, if it ain't the half-breed brats come to soil our decent town." Kim stiffened, drawing the children closer. Daniel rose to his full height, turning to face the speaker. A group of men had gathered nearby, led by Silas Trumbull, the wealthy rancher whose spread dominated the valley. Trumbull's silver-streaked hair and fine clothes marked him as a man of means, but the curl of his lip spoke of something far less refined. "Ain't right," Trumbull continued, his voice carrying across the platform. "These mixed-blood mongrels got no place here among civilized folk. Ought to ship 'em back to the reservation where they belong." Daniel's hand tightened into a fist at his side, but he kept his voice level. "These children are my family now, mister." Trumbull: "They've got as much right to be here as anyone." "Family?" Trumbull spat the word like it tasted bitter. "Marrying some dried-up widow's a far cry from claiming Indian spawn as kin. Mark my words, Boone, harboring their kind will bring nothing but trouble." Thomas pressed his face into Kim's skirts, while Sarah stood straight-backed, her young face a mask of dignity that mimicked her grandmother's. Daniel felt a surge of pride at their composure, even as anger burned in his chest at the cruel words. Rather than respond to Trumbull's taunts, Daniel turned his back on the men and knelt once more beside the children. "Let's get your trunks loaded up," he said gently. "Got a wagon waiting to take us home." He lifted their luggage easily, carrying both trunks at once to demonstrate the truth of his earlier words about strength. This drew a tiny smile from Thomas, though the boy quickly hid it. Daniel helped Kim and the children into the wagon, positioning himself between them and the crowd of onlookers. As he took up the reins, Trumbull's voice followed them. "Better watch yourself, Boone. Town's got standards to maintain. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to your new family." The threat hung in the air like frost, but Daniel kept his eyes forward as he clucked to the horses. The wagon rolled away from the station, leaving behind a wake of muttered curses and hostile stares. Once they were beyond the town limits, Kim's composure crumbled. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks as she held the children close. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring such hatred down on you, Daniel. Perhaps we should—" "No," Daniel cut in, his voice gentle but firm. "Don't you apologize for other folks' meanness. Ain't nothing wrong with these children except what lives in small minds." He glanced at Sarah and Thomas, who watched him with solemn eyes. "My cabin's up ahead. It ain't much, but it's solid. Good place to start fresh." "Will they always hate us?" Sarah asked quietly, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. Daniel was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Some folks let fear poison their hearts," he finally said. "But there's good people too, once you get to know them. Just got to give them time to see past their own shadows." The wagon rolled on through the morning, following the winding road into the foothills. Kim gradually settled, though Daniel could see the worry lines etched deep around her eyes. The children began to relax slightly, taking in the stunning mountain views with quiet wonder. Inside, doubt gnawed at Daniel's certainty. He had no experience with children, let alone those who would face such prejudice. The cabin suddenly seemed too small, too rough for this ready-made family. But as Thomas pointed excitedly at a deer bounding through the brush, and Sarah asked softly about the different types of trees they passed, Daniel felt something warm unfold in his chest. These children needed a protector, someone to stand between them and the world's cruelty. Looking at Kim's proud, worried face, Daniel silently renewed his wedding vows, adding a deeper layer of commitment. Whatever came, they would face it together. The wagon continued its steady climb toward home, leaving the town and its prejudices behind for now, though the memory of Trumbull's threats lingered like storm clouds on the horizon. The mountain path wound higher through stands of pine and aspen, the wagon's wheels creaking as Daniel guided the horses carefully around sharp bends. After nearly an hour's climb, he drew the team to a halt before a clearing. There, nestled against the mountainside, stood his cabin. "Home," he announced simply, helping Kim and the children down from the wagon. The cabin rose solid and strong, its squared logs fitted tight against mountain storms. A stone chimney stretched up one side, thin smoke curling from its top. Wide eaves sheltered a covered porch, and neat stacks of firewood lined the walls. Everything spoke of careful craftsmanship, of years of patient labor. Sarah and Thomas stayed close to their grandmother as Daniel carried their trunks inside. Kim paused in the doorway, taking in her new home. Afternoon light streamed through 2 windows, illuminating the single large room. A cooking hearth dominated one wall, its fire casting warmth throughout the space. A heavy table with 4 chairs stood in the center, while a curtained alcove held a bed. Simple furnishings, all made by hand, lined the walls: a dresser, shelves filled with tools and books, hooks holding clothes and gear. "It ain't fancy," Daniel said quietly, watching her face. "But it's dry and warm." "It's lovely," Kim answered, meaning it. Though masculine in its simplicity, the cabin held an air of peace she hadn't expected. Thomas ventured a few steps inside, his eyes wide. "You built this yourself?" Daniel nodded. "Every log. Took 3 summers." "How?" the boy asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his shyness. "I'll show you sometime if you'd like." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife and piece of wood. "For now, would you like to see how to carve?" While Thomas watched, fascinated, Daniel's big hands moved with surprising delicacy, shaping the wood into the form of a small horse. Sarah drifted closer to watch as well, though she kept one eye on her grandmother. Kim had already set to work, unpacking the provisions she'd brought and assessing the hearth. "I'll fix us something to eat," she said, drawing her apron from her. "Trunk." "There's flour and beans in the bin," Daniel offered, "and salt pork hanging in the lean-to out back. Help yourself to whatever you find." Soon the cabin filled with domestic sounds: the chop of Kim's knife against vegetables, the scratch of Daniel's carving, the children's quiet murmurs as they gradually began exploring their new home. Sarah discovered a shelf of books and ran her fingers longingly over their spines. Thomas found a collection of Daniel's earlier carvings and studied them with growing excitement. The afternoon light was fading when Kim called them to supper. She'd managed to create a hearty stew from her provisions and Daniel's stores, served with cornbread still warm from the hearth. Daniel lit the oil lamp that hung above the table, its gentle glow bringing them together in a pool of light. "Shall we say grace?" Kim asked, reaching for Sarah's hand on one side and Thomas's on the other. Daniel completed their circle, his large hand engulfing Thomas's small one. After the prayer, they ate in relative silence, broken only by occasional requests to pass the cornbread. Daniel noticed how Kim made sure the children ate their fill before taking much herself. When Thomas reached for seconds, she smiled in quiet victory. As Kim cleared the dishes, Sarah tugged at her sleeve. "Grandmother, could we sing our evening song, like we used to?" Kim glanced uncertainly at Daniel, who nodded encouragement. "I'd like to hear it." The children stood beside their grandmother, and their voices rose in simple harmony. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." The familiar psalm, set to a gentle tune, filled the cabin with unexpected grace. Daniel found himself moved by the sight of them: Kim's dignified face, Sarah's earnest concentration, Thomas's small hand clutching his sister's. They made a picture he'd never imagined in his solitary life, yet somehow it felt right. When the song ended, Kim helped the children prepare for bed. Daniel had already arranged a sleeping area for them behind a curtain he'd hung that afternoon, using spare quilts to make pallets on the floor. Soon their breathing deepened into sleep, leaving the adults alone by the fire. Kim sat in one of the chairs, her hands folded in her lap. "There's something I must tell you," she said softly, careful not to wake the children. "Something that may bring trouble." Daniel settled into the chair across from her, waiting. "My son, the children's father, he had debts before he died. To Silas Trumbull, Her voice caught slightly. He'd borrowed money to improve his land, the piece I'm holding in trust for Sarah and Thomas. I've been making payments when I can, but Trumbull's trying to claim the land, Daniel finished, understanding dawning. That's why he was at the station today. It ain't just about the children being mixed blood. Kim nodded. The land adjoins his range. He's been trying to expand for years. I have the deed, properly filed, but he's a powerful man. I fear he'll find a way to take it, leave the children with nothing of their father's legacy. Daniel's jaw tightened as he stared into the fire. How much is owed? $200. Kim twisted her hands. I've managed to pay half already, but we'll find a way, Daniel said firmly. I've got some savings. And spring brings work, lumber cutting, maybe some carpentry in town. He met her worried gaze. We'll face it together. A wolf howled in the distance, its cry echoing off the mountainsides. Another answered, the sound drifting down from the timberline. Kim shivered slightly, though the cabin was warm. They won't come near, Daniel assured her. Just marking their territory. Like Trumbull, Kim said quietly. Daniel nodded, understanding the comparison. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fires dance while the wolves called to each other in the gathering night. The children slept peacefully behind their curtain, unaware of the threats, both animal and human, that lurked in the darkness beyond their new home. Get some rest, Daniel finally said, rising. I'll bank the fire and sleep out here by the hearth. He paused, then added gently, We'll sort it all out. Might take time, but we will. Kim stood, smoothing her skirts. Thank you, Daniel. For everything. He ducked his head, uncomfortable with gratitude. Ain't nothing. Just doing what's right. As Kim disappeared behind the curtain to the bed alcove, Daniel added wood to the fire, making sure it would last the night. The wolves had gone quiet, but their earlier chorus lingered in his mind, a reminder of all that threatened this fragile new family. He settled onto his bedroll by the hearth, listening to the soft breathing of his unexpected household and pondering what tomorrow might bring. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft gold as Daniel hitched his team to the wagon. The horses stomped and snorted, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. He'd risen early to ensure everything was ready for their trip into town, checking each piece of tack with careful attention. Kim emerged from the cabin, adjusting her shawl against the morning chill. Sarah and Thomas followed, their eyes bright with anticipation of their first real trip to town. Daniel helped them all onto the wagon bench, making sure they were settled before taking up the reins. Ready? He asked, glancing at his new family. Kim nodded, drawing the children close on either side of her. The wagon wheels creaked as they started down the mountain trail, the familiar sounds of leather and wood working together filling the quiet morning. As they approached town, Sarah pressed closer to her grandmother, eyes wide at the sight of other children walking toward the schoolhouse. The building stood proud on the edge of town, its white paint bright in the morning sun. Through the windows, they could see students already settling at their desks. Sarah's face pressed against the wagon's side panel, watching longingly. "Grandmother," she whispered, "do you think—" Before she could finish, a woman in a neat blue dress stepped out onto the schoolhouse steps. Miss Margaret Evans, the schoolmarm, raised a hand in greeting as their wagon passed. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she called, then smiled warmly at Kim and the children. "Won't you stop a moment?" Daniel pulled the wagon to a halt, surprised by the friendly welcome. Miss Evans approached, her manner direct but kind. "Mrs. Hensley, I heard you'd arrived," she said, extending her hand to Kim, "and these must be your grandchildren. I'd be honored to have them join our school." Kim's hands tightened in her lap. "Miss Evans, that's very kind, but—" "No buts," the teacher interrupted gently. "Every child deserves an education." She glanced meaningfully at several townspeople who had paused to stare. "We can complete the enrollment right now if you'd like." Daniel watched Kim straighten her spine, drawing strength from somewhere deep inside. "Yes," she said clearly. "We would like that very much." They followed Miss Evans into the schoolhouse, the children staying close to Kim's skirts. Daniel hung back, watching as the teacher efficiently prepared the paperwork, asking Sarah and Thomas a few gentle questions about their previous schooling. "Sarah reads quite well," Kim offered proudly. "And Thomas has a gift for numbers." Miss Evans smiled, making notes in her ledger. "Excellent. They can start tomorrow, if that suits." The children's faces lit up, though they quickly looked to their grandmother for confirmation. Kim nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude. Leaving the schoolhouse, they made their way to the mercantile. Daniel helped them down from the wagon, noting how Sarah clutched her new primer to her chest like a treasure. Inside the store, Kim carefully selected necessities: flour, sugar, coffee, and a bolt of sturdy cloth. The bell above the door jangled, and Silas Trumbull's bulk filled the doorway. The rancher's eyes fixed on Kim, his expression darkening. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, voice deceptively pleasant. "Just the person I wanted to see." Daniel moved closer to Kim, his presence solid and protective. "I've been reviewing those loan papers," Trumbull continued. "Seems to me the simplest solution would be for you to sign over that land claim. Save yourself a lot of trouble." Kim's voice remained steady, though Daniel saw her hands tremble slightly. "That land belongs to my grandchildren, Mr. Trumbull. Their father's legacy." Trumbull's face hardened. "Legacy? That half-breed." "That's enough," Daniel cut in, his quiet voice carrying steel. "The lady said no." The rancher's eyes narrowed, measuring Daniel's resolve. The store fell silent, other customers watching the confrontation. Finally, Trumbull stepped back. "Think about it, Mrs. Hensley," he said. "Offer won't stand forever." He turned on his heel and left, the door slamming behind him. Kim sagged slightly, and Daniel's hand found her elbow, steadying her. "Let's finish up here," he said gently. "Time to head home." The ride back to the cabin was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Inside, Kim busied herself preparing supper while Sarah showed Thomas the pictures in her new primer. When they gathered at the table, Daniel surprised them all by clearing his throat. "Might we pray?" he asked hesitantly. "Been a while for me, but—" Kim's eyes softened. "Of course." Daniel bowed his head, his rough hands clasping those of Kim and Thomas. "Lord," he began slowly, "thank you for this food. For this family you've given me. Help us face whatever comes with courage and faith. Amen." "Amen," the others echoed softly. After the meal, while the children prepared for bed, Kim settled in the chair by the fire, with Daniel's work shirts in her lap. Her needle flashed in the lamplight, mending tears and reinforcing worn seams with tiny, even stitches. Daniel watched her from his place by the hearth, something deep inside him shifting at the simple domesticity of the scene. This woman who'd faced down Trumbull's threats now sat peacefully mending his clothes, as if she'd always belonged here. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. Kim looked up, her needle pausing. "I want to," she replied simply. "It's what family does." Family. The word echoed in Daniel's mind as he watched her return to her mending. The cabin felt different now, warmed by more than just the fire. Though Trumbull's threats loomed like storm clouds on the horizon, here in this moment, he felt the first real stirrings of hope. Sarah's voice drifted from behind the curtain, helping Thomas practice his letters for tomorrow. Kim hummed softly as she sewed, the tune matching the hymn they'd sung the night before. Daniel added wood to the fire, its crackling a comfortable counterpoint to the domestic sounds around him. These simple acts, prayers spoken, clothes mended, lessons shared, were weaving them together, thread by thread, into something new and precious, something worth protecting, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Soft white flakes drifted from the pewter sky, dusting the mountain landscape in fresh snow. The days had settled into a comfortable rhythm at the cabin, each member of the newly formed family finding their place in the daily routine. Daniel's axe rang out clear and steady most mornings, the sound of wood splitting punctuating the quiet mountain air. He worked methodically, building up the woodpile that would see them through the deepening winter. From his spot by the chopping block, he could see smoke curling from the cabin's chimney, carrying the scent of fresh bread that Kim baked each morning. Inside, Kim moved with quiet purpose, dividing her time between household tasks and teaching the children. She had arranged a small classroom area near the warmth of the hearth, where Sarah and Thomas sat at a rough-hewn table Daniel had crafted for their studies. Their neat columns of numbers and carefully printed letters brought a proud smile to Kim's face as she guided them through their lessons. Evenings found them gathered around the fire, Kim's worn Bible open in her lap as she read by lamplight. Daniel listened, his hands busy whittling small wooden animals for the children, while Sarah and Thomas sat wrapped in quilts, their faces glowing in the firelight. The peaceful routine was broken one morning by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, watching as a rider approached through the swirling snow. The man carried a leather post bag across his saddle. The stage messenger. "Letter for Mrs. Hensley," the rider called, pulling a thick envelope from his bag. Kim's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Daniel watched her face pale as she read, and his heart sank before she even spoke. "It's from the county clerk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Silas Trumbull has filed a petition with the judge. He means to seize the children's land for debt repayment." Sarah and Thomas pressed close to their grandmother, fear plain on their young faces. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read the formal language over Kim's shoulder. "We'll ride into town tomorrow," he said firmly. "Reverend Josiah will know what to do. He's dealt with Trumbull before." Kim nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. That evening, their scripture reading focused on David and Goliath, the familiar words carrying new meaning as they faced their own giant. Morning brought clearer skies but bitter cold. Daniel hitched the team early, laying warm bricks wrapped in flannel under the wagon seats. Kim bundled the children in every quilt they owned until they resembled colorful, overstuffed packages. The town was quiet when they arrived, most folks staying close to their fires on such a cold morning. Smoke rose straight up from chimneys in the still air as Daniel guided the wagon toward the small parsonage beside the church. Reverend Josiah welcomed them into his study, a cramped but warm room lined with books. To their surprise, Henry, the Ute Scout, was already there, discussing matters of the nearby reservation with the preacher. The Reverend listened intently as Kim explained their situation, his weathered face growing serious as she detailed Trumbull's legal maneuver. Henry moved closer to the fire, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Trumbull tried similar tactics with my people," Henry said quietly. "He twists treaty words like rope, trying to bind up what isn't his." Reverend Josiah nodded. "Henry knows more about local law than most lawyers," he explained. "He's helped many families keep their land against false claims." Hope stirred in Kim's chest as Henry outlined several precedents that might help their case. The Scouts' knowledge of both frontier treaties and territorial statutes revealed depths that most townspeople never suspected. "The harvest supper's tonight at the meeting hall," Reverend Josiah said when they had finished discussing strategy. "You should come. Let folks see you as family, not strangers." Daniel shifted uncomfortably at the thought of such a public gathering, but Kim's hand found his, squeezing gently. He nodded, understanding the importance of building bridges with their neighbors. That evening, lantern light spilled from the meeting hall windows, and the sound of fiddle music drifted on the cold air. Daniel helped Kim and the children down from the wagon, taking a deep breath before opening the heavy wooden door. The large room was warm and bright, decorated with autumn leaves and late-season flowers. Tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes, and the wooden floor had been cleared for dancing. Conversations paused briefly as they entered, but Reverend Josiah quickly approached, greeting them warmly. "Friends," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "welcome Daniel and Kim Boone and their grandchildren Sarah and Thomas. They've come to share in our harvest celebration." Daniel stepped forward, his voice rougher but clear. "We're much obliged for the welcome," he said, one hand resting protectively on Thomas's shoulder. "Kim's made her famous apple pie, if anyone's of a mind to try it." A few chuckles broke the tension, and soon Kim was surrounded by women asking for her recipe. Sarah and Thomas found themselves drawn into a group of children playing marbles in one corner, their initial shyness melting away. Daniel watched in quiet amazement as the evening unfolded. Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, praised Kim's pie enthusiastically. Mr. Jenkins, who owned the lumber mill, engaged Daniel in a lengthy discussion about wood grain and seasoning techniques. Even the children seemed to forget their differences, their laughter mixing freely as they played. The fiddle struck up a lively tune, and couples began to dance. Daniel stood awkwardly until Kim approached, her eyes twinkling. "I don't know the steps," he admitted quietly. "Neither do I," she whispered back, "but we can learn together." They joined the other couples, following the simple patterns as best they could. Daniel's size made him somewhat clumsy, but Kim's quiet laughter at their mistakes held no mockery, only joy. From their corner, Sarah and Thomas watched their grandmother dance, their faces shining. Henry, who had been teaching the children traditional string games, smiled at their happiness. The music flowed from one song to another, and Daniel found himself relaxing into the rhythm of community. He saw nods of greeting from men who had previously turned away. Women who once whispered behind their hands now smiled openly at Kim. As the evening drew to a close, Reverend Josiah led everyone in a hymn of thanksgiving. Daniel's deep voice joined the others, no longer self-conscious about singing in public. Kim leaned against his arm, her voice clear and sweet beside him, while Sarah and Thomas sang out with childish enthusiasm. Looking around the hall at the faces of neighbors who were becoming friends, Daniel felt something shift inside him. He had spent so many years alone, convinced that solitude was his destiny. Now, surrounded by music and laughter, his family beside him, he understood what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. The children fell asleep on the ride home, their heads pillowed on Kim's lap. Fresh snow had fallen while they celebrated, transforming the landscape into a glittering wonderland under the rising moon. Daniel glanced at his sleeping family, their faces peaceful in the starlight. Trumbull's threat still loomed, but they no longer faced it alone. In the warmth of community, they had found unexpected allies and growing strength. Dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold as Daniel stirred from sleep. For the first time in years, his usual solitude felt different, warmer somehow. The sounds of Kim moving about in the kitchen and the children's soft whispers brought an unfamiliar lightness to his heart. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, heading out to tend the animals before breakfast. The morning air bit sharp and clean, but Daniel barely noticed the cold. His mind kept drifting back to the previous night's harvest supper, to Kim's hand in his as they danced, to the way the community had begun to soften toward them. When he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, the sight that greeted him made him pause in the doorway. Kim stood at the iron stove, her hair neat under a simple cap, stirring a pot of porridge. Sarah carefully set out tin plates while Thomas struggled with a too-heavy water bucket. "Here, let me help with that," Daniel said, moving to take the bucket from the boy. "I can do it," Thomas insisted, though. Water sloshed over his boots. "Reckon you can," Daniel agreed, "but sometimes it's good to accept help, even when you're strong enough alone." Kim turned from the stove, hiding a smile. Just like someone else I know," she said, her eyes twinkling at Daniel. The gentle teasing caught him off guard, but not unpleasantly. A chuckle escaped before he could stop it, and soon Sarah and Thomas joined in, their laughter filling the cabin with warmth. Over breakfast, the children chatted eagerly about their new friends from the harvest supper. Sarah described the string games Henry had taught them, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. Thomas proudly showed off the marble he'd won, rolling it across the rough wooden table. "Best get ready," Kim said when the plates were cleared. "We need to see Miss Evans about your schooling." Daniel watched the joy bloom on Sarah's face, though Thomas looked less certain. As the children scrambled to wash up, Kim touched Daniel's arm lightly. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The simple words carried weight, making Daniel's throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. The ride into town felt different from previous journeys. People called out greetings as they passed, nodding respectfully to Daniel and Kim. Outside the general store, Mrs. Patterson waved warmly, and Mr. Jenkins paused his work at the lumber mill to tip his hat. Miss Evans met them at the schoolhouse door, her face bright with welcome. "I've been hoping you'd come," she said, ushering them inside. The classroom was warm and inviting, walls covered with maps and careful penmanship samples. "Every child deserves an education," Miss Evans declared firmly when Kim began to explain their situation. "Sarah and Thomas will start Monday morning. I'll not hear any argument about it." Sarah could barely contain her excitement, practically bouncing as Miss Evans showed them the primers and slates they would need. Thomas hung back, uncertain, until Miss Evans mentioned they were studying local wildlife and needed someone who knew about tracking. "Henry says I'm good at spotting tracks," Thomas offered shyly. "Then you'll be a wonderful help to the class," Miss Evans assured him. Daniel watched Kim brush away happy tears as they left the schoolhouse, the children clutching their new books. Her joy made something shift in his chest, a feeling both uncomfortable and wonderful. Later that afternoon, Daniel rode out to help Henry mend fencing along the reservation boundary. The physical work felt good, familiar, but the company was new. Henry worked steadily, his movements efficient and precise. "Never thought I'd be a husband," Daniel said suddenly, driving a post into the frozen ground, let alone father to 2 children. Henry nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. "The Great Spirit often leads us down unexpected trails." "Don't rightly know if I'm doing it proper," Daniel admitted, voicing doubts he'd carried since that first day at the train station. "Ain't had no practice at being family." Henry tested the wire tension before responding. "A strong tree doesn't grow from experience," he said thoughtfully. "It grows from being firmly rooted, faithful to its purpose." He looked directly at Daniel. "I see how you stand between them and harm. How you choose them each day. That is strength." The simple wisdom settled deep in Daniel's heart as they worked through the afternoon. When he rode home, the setting sun painted long shadows across the snow, but the cabin windows glowed with welcome. Inside, Kim had supper waiting, simple fare but filling. The children told Daniel about their new books, their voices tumbling over each other in excitement. He found himself sharing stories from his own childhood, memories he'd thought long forgotten. After the children were settled in their bed, Kim made coffee. She and Daniel sat before the fire, the comfortable silence broken only by the pop and crackle of burning logs. When she passed him his cup, their fingers brushed. The touch was brief but electric, carrying a tenderness that made Daniel's heart beat faster. Kim's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she settled closer, their shoulders just touching as they watched the flames dance. Unknown to the peaceful family, dark figures moved through the trees beyond the cabin's warm circle of light. Trumbull's hired men watched the domestic scene through frosted windows, their whispered plans lost in the bitter wind. But inside, Daniel and Kim sat contentedly, their coffee growing cool, neither wanting to break the gentle spell of their first real evening as husband and wife. The fire burned low, casting soft shadows on the walls. Sarah murmured something in her sleep, and Thomas shifted in his bed, making the floorboards creak. Everything felt right, proper, as if the pieces of a long, scattered puzzle had finally found their proper places. In that moment, Daniel understood what Henry had meant about strength. It wasn't about knowing all the answers or having years of practice. It was about choosing to stay, to protect, to love, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. Kim's head nodded slightly, her eyes growing heavy. Without thinking, Daniel reached for her hand again, carefully enfolding it in his larger one. She smiled, a soft, sleepy expression that made his heart swell with tenderness. Outside, a twig snapped beneath a stealthy boot, but the sound was lost in the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Inside the cabin, the fire's warmth held them safe, at least for this one peaceful evening. The morning dawned crisp and clear, frost painting delicate patterns. On the cabin windows, Sarah and Thomas bundled up in their warmest clothes, excitement bright in their eyes despite the early hour. It was their first official day of school. "Mind your manners," Kim reminded them, adjusting Thomas's woolen scarf. "And remember what Miss Evans taught you about raising your hand before speaking." Daniel stood by the door, watching the familiar morning routine that had become precious to him over these past weeks. Sarah clutched her primer to her chest, while Thomas fidgeted with his slate pencil. "I'll walk them to school," Daniel said, reaching for his coat. "Got some logs to split afterward. Shouldn't take more than the morning." Kim nodded, already moving to the stove where a pot of stew simmered. "I'll have dinner ready when you return." Her smile was warm, domestic, everything Daniel had never known he wanted. The walk to school was pleasant, despite the cold. Sarah skipped ahead, pointing out rabbit tracks in the snow, while Thomas tried to match Daniel's long strides. At the schoolhouse, Miss Evans greeted them warmly, ushering the children inside where other students were already settling into their seats. Daniel watched until they disappeared through the door, then turned back toward home, his axe slung over one shoulder. The morning passed in the steady rhythm of splitting logs, the sharp crack of wood echoing across the snow-covered yard. Inside, Kim hummed as she worked, the smell of simmering stew drifting through the cabin's open window. The thunder of hooves shattered the peace. Daniel straightened, axe still in hand, as 5 riders burst into the yard, snow flying from their horses' hooves. He recognized Trumbull's men by their distinctive gun belts and the arrogant set of their shoulders. "Step aside, Boone," the leader called out, already dismounting. "We've got papers for them half-breed children." Daniel's grip tightened on the axe handle. "What papers?" "Legal guardianship," another man sneered, waving a document. "Mister, Trumbull's been appointed by the county judge. Those brats belong to him now." "Like hell they do," Daniel growled, but 2 men were already pushing past him toward the schoolhouse. The other 3 surrounded Daniel, guns drawn. Kim appeared in the doorway, face pale. "Daniel!" "Get back inside!" he shouted. But it was too late. The sound of children screaming carried across the yard as Trumbull's men dragged Sarah and Thomas from the schoolhouse. Miss Evans followed, protesting loudly, but was shoved roughly aside. Daniel surged forward, axe swinging. He caught one man in the shoulder with the flat of the blade, sending him sprawling. Another rushed him from behind. They grappled in the snow, fists flying. Daniel's size gave him advantage, but there were too many. A gun butt cracked against his temple, making the world spin. "No!" Kim's cry pierced the chaos. "Leave him alone!" Through blurred vision, Daniel saw Sarah and Thomas being lifted onto horses, their terrified faces streaming with tears. He struggled to rise, only to be kicked back down. Rough hands seized his arms, dragging him to his feet. "You're under arrest, Boone," one of Trumbull's men announced with satisfaction. "Assault with a deadly weapon. Judge'll be real interested in that." They bound his hands with rope, ignoring Kim's pleas. Daniel fought against the restraints until another blow to the head left him dazed. They marched him through town like a common criminal, past staring townsfolk and whispered comments. The jail was cold, iron bars cutting off any hope of rescue. They threw him into a cell, the sheriff watching with disapproving eyes. "Should have known better than to fight the law, Boone." "It ain't law," Daniel spat, blood trickling from his split lip. "It's theft, plain and simple." But his words fell on deaf ears. Through the small window he could see Kim running down the street toward the jail, her skirts flying. Someone laughed cruelly. "Too old to keep a man," a voice called out. "Too soft to keep brats." More laughter followed. Daniel gripped the bars until his knuckles turned white, helpless rage burning in his chest as he watched Kim flee toward the boarding house, shoulders shaking with sobs. Hours crawled by. Through the window, Daniel caught glimpses of Trumbull's men riding past with Sarah and Thomas, heading toward the wealthy rancher's sprawling property outside town. The children's faces were streaked with tears, their small bodies bouncing in the saddle as they were carried away from everything familiar and safe. Night fell heavy and cold. In his cell, Daniel paced like a caged bear, mind racing for solutions but finding none. The law was supposed to protect the innocent, but Trumbull had twisted it to serve his own ends. The thought of Sarah and Thomas alone and frightened at the ranch made Daniel's heart ache with a father's pain he'd never expected to feel. Somewhere in the darkness, he knew Kim knelt in her boarding house room, seeking strength in prayer. The memory of her humiliation in the street burned like acid in his throat. He'd promised to protect them all, and he'd failed. The night pressed close, thick with despair, as Daniel slumped against the cell wall, his dreams of family lying shattered around him like broken glass. Outside, the wind howled through empty streets, carrying the echo of children's tears and a mother's broken prayers into the uncaring dark. The night wrapped around the jail like a heavy blanket, broken only by pale moonlight filtering through the barred window. Daniel paced his cell for what felt like hours before finally sinking to his knees on the cold floor. His usual quiet faith burst, forth in words, desperate and raw. "Lord," he whispered, voice rough with emotion, "I ain't much for talking, but I need you now. These children, this woman you've given me to protect, I've failed them." His broad shoulders shook. "I'm not strong enough, not wise enough. But if you've got a plan in all this, I surrender to it." The words came easier now, like a dam breaking. "Give me wisdom beyond my learning. Give me strength beyond my muscle. And Lord, protect those little ones tonight." Across town in her boarding house room, Kim knelt beside her narrow bed, her Bible open before her. Tears dropped onto the worn pages, but her voice remained steady. "Father, you know the hearts of my grandchildren. You see their fear. Guide us through this valley." Her fingers traced the familiar words of Psalm 23. "Show us your path to justice." Neither knew they prayed at the same hour, their separate vigils joining like tributary streams flowing to the same river. The night passed slowly, marked by the town clock's solemn strikes and the distant howl of coyotes. Dawn brought little comfort. Daniel heard the whispers through his cell window as townspeople passed. "Maybe Trumbull's right," one woman murmured. "Those children might be better off with someone of means." "Ain't natural anyway," a man replied. "That marriage of convenience, taking on half-breed young'uns." Daniel's fists clenched, but he held his peace, remembering the previous night's prayers. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when Reverend Josiah's familiar step echoed down the jail corridor. "Brother Daniel," the preacher's voice was warm with concern. He gripped the cell bars, studying Daniel's bruised face. "I came as soon as I heard." "Reverend." Daniel stood respectfully. "I appreciate the visit, but unless you can help get those children back." "The Lord's justice moves in its own time," Reverend Josiah said firmly. "But it does move. Remember Joseph in Egypt? What his brothers meant for evil, God used for good." Daniel slumped against the wall. "I ain't Joseph. I'm just a mountain man who thought he could protect a family." No, the preacher agreed. You're not Joseph. You're Daniel Boone, a man who stood up when others looked away. Trust God's timing in this. He hasn't brought you this far to abandon you now. Before Daniel could respond, quick footsteps announced Henry's arrival. The Ute Scout's normally calm face was tight with anger. This is wrong, Henry declared, nodding to both men. Trumbull thinks money can buy the law, but he forgets there are those who remember justice. He turned to Daniel. I have friends in town, good people who see through Trumbull's greed. Give me time to rally them. The children don't have time, Daniel said hoarsely. Then we must work quickly, Henry replied. But we will work within the law. Violence will only prove Trumbull right. Across town, Kim had already begun her own campaign. She stood in Miss Evans's parlor, her hands clasped tightly together. Please, she said. You've seen Sarah and Thomas in your classroom. You know they belong with family who loves them. The schoolteacher's kind face was troubled. Of course I'll testify. Those children are bright, eager to learn. They were just starting to feel at home. She touched Kim's arm gently. I'll speak to some of the other parents, too. Mrs. Wilson was saying just yesterday how polite Sarah is. Kim's next stop was the general store, where she'd often traded her fine needlework for supplies. The shopkeeper's wife listened sympathetically. Folks are starting to see through Trumbull, she confided, measuring out coffee beans. His cattle may feed the town, but his pride's got more than a few backs up. My herald says he'll stand with you if it comes to speaking before the judge. By afternoon, Kim had visited a dozen homes. Some doors closed in her face, but others opened wider than expected. The baker's wife pressed a loaf of fresh bread into her hands. The blacksmith promised to speak of Daniel's honest dealings. Even the telegraph operator, a quiet man who rarely took sides, offered to testify about Kim's regular correspondence with her late son. The sun was setting when Kim finally made her way to the jail. Her feet ached, but hope had begun to kindle in her heart. She found the window to Daniel's cell around the back, away from prying eyes. Daniel? She whispered. He appeared immediately, his large hands gripping the bars. Kim! Are you all right? Have you heard anything about the children? Not yet, she admitted, but we're not alone anymore. People are starting to stand with us. She reached through the bars to grasp his rough hand. I won't give up, Daniel. Not while there's breath in my body. His fingers tightened around hers. I've been praying, he said, the admission clearly costing his pride. All night. Never done that before. I felt it, Kim said softly. Somehow I knew you were praying too. It gave me strength. They stood in silence for a moment, hands clasped through iron bars, the evening star appearing above the mountains. Their shared faith, tested by fire, had become stronger than the metal separating them. Reverend Josiah came, Daniel murmured. Reminded me of Joseph in Egypt. Henry's gathering support too. God's moving, Kim agreed. I can feel it. Miss Evans will testify about the children's progress in school. Others are willing to speak up too. Trumbull won't give up easily. Neither will we. Kim's voice held steel beneath its gentleness. These past weeks you've become more than just my husband of convenience, Daniel. You're the father those children deserve. We'll fight this together, with prayer and truth. A guard's footsteps approached, forcing Kim to step back. I'll return tomorrow, she promised. Daniel watched her disappear into the gathering dusk, her quiet strength moving him more than any show of force. In his cell, he knelt once more, this time with greater peace despite his circumstances. Across town, Kim did the same, their prayers rising together like evening smoke from separate fires, joining somewhere between earth and heaven. The night was still cold, still heavy with worry for Sarah and Thomas, but it no longer felt hopeless. Small sparks of support had been kindled throughout the day, promising to grow into something stronger than Trumbull's influence. Through the barred window, Daniel could see the evening star Kim had noticed earlier. Its steady light reminded him of her words, "God's moving." For the first time since his arrest, Daniel felt the truth of it in his bones. Whatever came next, they would face it together, their shared faith anchoring them in the storm. The first gray light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the town in shadowy tones. Henry walked purposefully toward the sheriff's office, followed by a small group of concerned citizens. Miss Evans clutched her teaching records close to her chest. The general store owner and his wife stood shoulder to shoulder. Even old Mr. Wilson, who rarely left his farm, had made the journey into town. Henry rapped firmly on the sheriff's door. "We need to speak with you about Daniel Boone." Sheriff Matthews opened the door, his badge gleaming dully in the early light. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the gathered townspeople. "What's all this about?" "We're here to petition for Daniel's release," Henry said, his voice steady. "These folks can testify to his character. There's no cause to keep him locked up." The sheriff's face hardened. "Man assaulted Mr. Trumbull's men. That's cause enough." "He was defending his family," Miss Evans stepped forward. "I've seen how he cares for those children in my classroom." They were thriving under his protection. One by one, the townspeople spoke up. The general store owner vouched for Daniel's honest dealings. Mr. Wilson testified to his skilled work and fair prices. Yet with each testimony, the sheriff's expression grew more distant. "Laws are laws," he said finally, "and Mr. Trumbull's got proper papers claiming guardianship. Now clear out, all of you, before I start wondering about disturbing the peace." Henry watched the sheriff retreat into his office, shoulders tight with anger. He had seen this before, justice bending to money's weight. But he wasn't finished yet. As darkness fell that evening, Henry moved silently through the shadows behind the jail. Reverend Josiah waited there, his usually. Cheerful face, solemn. "Are you certain about this?" the preacher whispered. "It could mean trouble for you both." Henry nodded. "Some troubles are worth facing." "You have the key?" Reverend Josiah produced a brass key from his pocket. "The deputy's a God-fearing man." When I explained the situation, he left this where I might find it. He'll be occupied with his prayers for the next hour. Working quickly, they unlocked the back door. Henry slipped inside while the preacher kept watch. Daniel's cell was at the end of the corridor. "Brother," Henry whispered, "it's time." Daniel rose from his bunk, understanding immediately. "Henry, you shouldn't risk yourself like this." "We all must answer to a higher law sometimes," Henry replied, working the cell lock. "Now hurry. Kim's waiting." They moved like shadows through the alleyways, avoiding the pools of lamplight. The town was quiet, with only a few windows still glowing. At the edge of town, Kim waited with 2 saddled horses, her face lighting up at the sight of Daniel. They came together in a fierce embrace, brief but filled with meaning. Kim's hands trembled against Daniel's back, and he held her tighter for a moment. "The children," he whispered. "Still at Trumbull's ranch," she said, pulling back reluctantly. "We have to hurry." Henry helped them mount up. "Ride careful. The moon's bright tonight." "Thank you, friend," Daniel said solemnly. "I won't forget this." "Go with God," Reverend Josiah added softly. "We'll be praying." The horses moved out at a steady walk until they cleared the town, then picked up speed. Fresh snow crunched beneath their hooves, the sound carrying in the still night air. They rode close together, following the winding trail toward Trumbull's sprawling ranch. After an hour's ride, Kim spoke quietly. "Daniel, there's something you should know." She reached into her coat and withdrew a folded document. "I have my son's deed to the land, properly filed with the territorial judge. I've kept it safe all this time." Daniel reined his horse closer, amazed. "You had legal proof all along?" Kim nodded. "It was my last safeguard. I couldn't risk Trumbull knowing until we had no choice. The judge's seal is clear. The land belongs to my grandchildren by right of inheritance." You're a remarkable woman, Daniel said softly. God surely guided me to that train station. They rode on until they found a sheltered spot in the woods near Trumbull's ranch. The horses needed rest, and they needed to plan. Daniel gathered dry wood while Kim spread their blankets in the lee of a large boulder. The small fire cast dancing shadows as they shared a humble meal of jerky and coffee. Kim's hands shook slightly as she poured the hot liquid into tin cups. "Are you afraid?" she asked, passing Daniel his cup. He considered the question honestly. "Not of Trumbull, but I fear failing you and the children." "You haven't failed us yet," Kim said firmly. "And you won't now." Daniel set his cup down and took her hands in his. "I want you to know something. When I face Trumbull tomorrow, I won't be carrying weapons." Daniel, "No," he said gently. "Violence won't solve this. We have truth and law on our side now, and more importantly, we have faith. God didn't bring us together just to abandon us here." Kim's eyes shone in the firelight. "When I first stepped off that train, I never imagined." She squeezed his hands. "You're a good man, Daniel Boone. Those children couldn't ask for a better father." They sat close together, the deed secure in Kim's coat pocket, watching the flames dance lower. The night was cold, but their shared warmth and purpose kept the chill at bay. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but for now, they had this moment of peace. Kim's heart pounded with both fear and faith as she touched the deed through her coat. So much depended on this single document: their future, the children's security, justice itself. Yet as she looked at Daniel's steady profile in the dying firelight, she felt her courage grow stronger. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together. The fire burned down to embers, and the stars wheeled overhead. In the distance, an owl called, and somewhere far off, a wolf answered. But here in their small camp, hope kept watch with them through the dark hours before dawn. Morning frost glittered like scattered diamonds across the valley, each breath visible in the crisp air. Daniel and Kim guided their horses down the last slope toward Trumbull's sprawling ranch house. The sun had barely crested the eastern mountains, painting the snow-dusted ground in shades of pink and gold. Daniel's mount snorted, steam rising from its nostrils as they approached the main gate. Before they could reach it, 4 armed men emerged from behind the fence posts, rifles held ready. Their boots crunched in the frozen grass as they spread out in a line across the path. "That's far enough," the tallest one called out, his Winchester gleaming dully in the early light. Daniel drew his horse to a stop, Kim halting beside him. Slowly, deliberately, he raised both hands, palms open to show he carried no weapons. "I've come for my children," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Sarah and Thomas belong with their grandmother and me." A derisive laugh cut through the tension. Silas Trumbull strode out from the barn, his expensive boots clicking against the frozen ground. "Your children," he sneered. "Those half-breed waifs have no rightful claim here." Kim straightened in her saddle, one hand moving to her coat pocket. "You're wrong, Mr. Trumbull." She withdrew the deed, the paper crackling in the cold. I have proof of their inheritance right here." Trumbull's face darkened as he stalked closer. "What's this?" A desperate old woman's attempt to cling to something that ain't hers. His voice dripped with mockery. "Too old to find a proper husband, so you trap some simple mountain man and wave around worthless papers?" The armed men chuckled, but Daniel noticed their eyes flickering uncertainly between their boss and the document Kim held. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. Along the road from town, curious townsfolk were gathering, drawn by rumors of the confrontation. "Hold steady," Daniel murmured to Kim, noting the growing crowd. Among them, he spotted Reverend Josiah's familiar black coat and Miss Evans's neat bonnet. The tension thickened as more rifles emerged from the ranch house windows. Daniel counted at least 6 more armed men taking positions. His hands remained raised, steady despite the morning chill. "Silas Trumbull," Reverend Josiah's voice rang out as he stepped forward from the crowd. "This has gone far enough. You've no right to those children." Miss Evans moved to stand beside the preacher, her normally gentle face set with determination. "I've had Sarah and Thomas in my classroom," she declared. "They're bright, well-cared-for children who belong with their family." "With Daniel and Kim." "Family?" Trumbull spat on the ground. "That's no proper family, just a collection of misfits trying to steal what's rightfully mine." A new voice cut through the muttering crowd. Henry emerged, his buckskins standing out among the townspeople's wool coats. He walked with purposeful steps toward the armed men, speaking directly to them rather than their employer. "You men," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Think carefully about what you're fighting for. Is this justice? Or are you just hired guns protecting one man's greed?" Several of the gunmen shifted uncomfortably, their rifles lowering slightly. The morning light caught the doubt in their eyes. Trumbull's face flushed red with rage. "Bring them out!" he bellowed toward the house. "Show everyone what they're really fighting over!" The front door banged open. 2 more men emerged, roughly dragging Sarah and Thomas between them. The children's faces were tear-stained, their clothes rumpled from rough handling. "Grandma!" Sarah's cry pierced the morning air. Thomas struggled silently against the grip on his arm, his small face set in a determined scowl, so like his grandmother's. Daniel's heart clenched at the sight, but he kept his voice steady. "Let them go, Trumbull. Take me instead if you need someone to blame. Just let the children return to their grandmother." A hush fell over the scene. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath in the frozen moment. Kim's hands trembled slightly, but her voice rang clear as she raised the deed high above her head. "This document proves the children's right to their father's land," she proclaimed. "It bears the territorial judge's seal." "The law is clear. The property belongs to Sarah and Thomas by inheritance." The crowd stirred, whispers spreading like ripples in a pond. Daniel watched several townspeople crane their necks to see the raised document, their expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding. "I've seen that seal before," someone called out. "That's proper legal paper, sure enough." "The judge won't take kindly to his documents being ignored," another voice added. More murmurs of agreement spread through the gathering. The armed men exchanged uncertain glances, their rifle barrels pointing more toward the ground than at Daniel and Kim. Trumbull's face twisted with fury as he watched his control of the situation slipping away. His eyes darted between the crowd, the children, and the damning document in Kim's hand. The morning frost continued to melt around them, dripping from the fence posts like nature itself was weeping at the scene. Sarah made another attempt to break free, calling out, "Papa Daniel." The simple words, spoken with such trust and need, seemed to hover in the crystal-clear air. Daniel's heart swelled at being called Papa for the first time, even as his hands remained raised in peaceful surrender. The crowd had grown larger now, with more townspeople arriving every minute. They formed a loose circle around the confrontation, their presence adding weight to every word and gesture. Miss Evans had moved closer to the children, her teacher's instinct to protect evident in her stance. Reverend Josiah stood like a pillar of quiet strength, his Bible visible in his coat pocket. Henry remained near the armed men, his calm presence a reminder of conscience. Kim held the deed steady, the morning sun catching the official seal. Her voice carried no trace of the too-old bride Trumbull had mocked, only the dignity of a mother defending her family. "The law and right are on our side, Mr. Trumbull. How much more will you risk to deny what's proper and just?" The thunder of approaching hoofbeats drew all eyes to the road. Sheriff Matthews galloped toward the gathering, his badge glinting in the morning light. He reined his horse to a stop, taking in the scene with practiced eyes, armed men, frightened children, and a crowd of townsfolk surrounding Trumbull's ranch. "What's all this about?" the sheriff demanded, dismounting smoothly. His weathered face creased with concern as he spotted Sarah and Thomas, still held by Trumbull's men. Kim urged her horse forward, the deed held carefully in her gloved hand. "Sheriff, I have here a legal document proving my grandchildren's rightful inheritance of their father's land." Her voice carried clear and strong across the yard. "It bears the territorial judge's seal and signature." Reverend Josiah stepped closer, his Bible tucked securely in one hand. "If I may, Sheriff." At Matthew's nod, he examined the deed carefully. "I've seen enough territorial documents to recognize Judge Morrison's seal. This is genuine, bearing all proper signatures and stamps." The sheriff took the document, studying it in the strengthening morning light. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as he read, growing louder as understanding spread. "So that's why Trumbull was in such a rush to claim that parcel," someone called out. "He knew the children had legal right to it." "Been lying to us all along," another voice added, "making us think those kids had no claim here." The mood of the gathering shifted palpably. Townspeople who had stood silent now moved closer to Daniel and Kim, their faces showing shame and resolve. Miss Evans placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder, while Henry's steady presence seemed to make Trumbull's gunmen increasingly nervous. "This deed is proper and binding," Sheriff Matthews announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "The land belongs to Sarah and Thomas Hensley, with their grandmother as legal guardian." He fixed Trumbull with a hard stare. "You've got no claim here, Silas." Trumbull's face twisted with rage. "You can't trust that paper. She's trying to steal what's rightfully mine." He lunged forward, reaching for Kim's reins. Before he could touch her horse, Henry and 3 townsmen grabbed him, pulling him back. "Enough, Trumbull," Henry said firmly. "The law speaks clear." Daniel finally lowered his hands, moving his horse closer to Kim's. Their fingers found each other, intertwining with quiet strength as they watched justice unfold. The morning sun broke through the gray clouds, washing the scene in golden light. "Release those children," Sheriff Matthews ordered Trumbull's men. "Now." The 2 men holding Sarah and Thomas hesitated, looking to their employer, but Trumbull was still struggling against those restraining him, his face purple with thwarted rage. One by one, the hired guns lowered their rifles. "Go on," the man holding Thomas said gruffly, releasing his grip. "Get to your family." Sarah broke free first, running toward Kim with a cry of joy. Thomas followed close behind, his small legs pumping hard across the frozen ground. Daniel swung down from his horse just in time to catch them both in his massive arms, lifting them high as tears gleamed in his eyes. "Papa Daniel," Sarah sobbed, burying her face in his shoulder. Thomas clung just as tightly, his usual stubborn expression melting into relief. Kim dismounted quickly, wrapping her arms around all 3 of them. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her face radiant with grateful tears. "Thank you for keeping us together." The crowd broke into spontaneous cheers and applause. Miss Evans wiped her eyes openly, while Reverend Josiah raised his Bible in blessing. Even some of Trumbull's men removed their hats, touched by the family's reunion. "Silas Trumbull," Sheriff Matthews said, his voice heavy with authority, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and attempting to defraud rightful landowners." He pulled out his handcuffs, the metal gleaming. "Your hired guns would be wise to clear out now, unless they want to join you in the jail." The armed men needed no further encouragement. They mounted up quickly, leaving their former employer to face justice alone. Trumbull struggled and cursed as the sheriff cuffed him, but the fight had gone out of him. His empire of intimidation crumbled in the face of truth and courage. "Daniel," Kim said softly, still holding their children close, "let's take our family home." He nodded, gathering Sarah and Thomas onto his horse while helping Kim mount hers. The crowd parted to let them pass, many reaching out to pat the children's hands or touch Kim's skirts in silent apology and support. As they rode away from Trumbull's ranch, The morning sun blazed fully over the mountains, melting the last of the frost. Behind them, they could hear the sheriff reading Trumbull his rights, Reverend Josiah's voice raised in prayer, and the happy chatter of townsfolk celebrating justice done. Sarah's small hand patted Daniel's chest where she sat before him. "I knew you'd come for us, Papa," she said with complete trust. "Always," Daniel replied, his deep voice rough with emotion. "That's what fathers do." Kim rode beside them, her face peaceful despite the tears drying on her cheeks. Thomas reached out from her saddle to grasp Daniel's sleeve, forming a chain of touch that linked them all together. The sun warmed their backs as they headed home, its light promising a new beginning for their unusual but unshakable family. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the dirt street as Daniel guided his wagon toward the small white church. Kim sat beside him, her Sunday dress freshly pressed, while Sarah and Thomas bounced excitedly in the back. The church windows glowed with early lamplight, and the sound of voices drifted out into the crisp evening air. "Look at all the people," Sarah whispered, clutching Thomas's hand. Indeed, it seemed the entire town had gathered, their horses and wagons filling the yard. Daniel helped Kim down from the wagon, his large hands gentle at her waist. She smoothed her skirts nervously, but her eyes shone with quiet joy. The children scrambled down after them, their faces scrubbed clean, their best clothes showing signs of Kim's careful mending. As they approached the church steps, Miss Evans hurried out to meet them. "The children are ready to sing," she said, gathering Sarah and Thomas with a warm smile. "We've been practicing special just for tonight." Inside, the little church blazed with light. Every oil lamp had been lit, their flames reflected in the window's darkening glass. The wooden pews were packed tight with townspeople, many of whom had scorned the family mere days before. Now they turned with welcoming faces, several women dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Reverend Josiah stood at the altar, his Bible open on the simple wooden pulpit. He smiled broadly as Daniel and Kim made their way down the aisle. The floorboards creaked beneath Daniel's heavy tread, but his step was sure. Kim walked beside him, her chin high, though her hand trembled slightly in the crook of his arm. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Josiah's voice filled the small sanctuary. "We gather tonight to witness something extraordinary. Not just the renewal of marriage vows, but the triumph of faith over fear, of love over prejudice, of God's perfect timing over human judgment." A murmur of "Amen" rippled through the congregation. Henry, seated near the front, nodded firmly. Even the sheriff was present, his badge catching the lamplight as he sat with hat in hand. "Daniel and Kim," the Reverend continued, "you first spoke vows in haste at the railway station, moved by the Spirit to trust God's leading. Tonight, you stand before us to affirm those vows, not in desperate circumstances, but in the fullness of understanding and commitment." Daniel turned to face Kim, his massive hands engulfing hers. The lamplight softened his weathered features, showing clearly the tenderness in his eyes. Kim gazed up at him, all her earlier nervousness replaced by steady certainty. "Daniel," Reverend Josiah said, "do you take this woman as your lawful wife, promising before God and these witnesses to love, honor, and cherish her, to protect and provide for her, to raise her grandchildren in faith and dignity until death parts you?" Daniel's deep voice carried to every corner of the church. "I do, with all my heart." "Kim, do you take this man as your lawful husband, promising before God and these witnesses to love, honor, and cherish him, to make a home with him, to support him in raising these children in faith and dignity, until death parts you?" "I do," Kim answered clearly, her voice strong with conviction, "with profound gratitude to God." At that moment, Miss Evans led Sarah, Thomas, and several other schoolchildren to the front of the church. Their young voices rose sweet and true in a hymn they had practiced in secret. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Tears spilled down Kim's cheeks as she listened to her grandchildren sing. Daniel's grip on her hands tightened, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Throughout the congregation, handkerchiefs appeared, and throats were cleared. When the children finished, Reverend Josiah raised his hands. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. I present to you again Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Boone." The church erupted in applause and calls of "Amen!" Sarah and Thomas rushed to embrace their grandparents, creating a family circle before the altar. Daniel gathered them all close, his massive frame seeming to shelter them from any future storms. As the applause died down, the congregation began moving toward the church steps, where tables had been set up laden with food. Women who had once whispered cruel gossip now approached Kim with covered dishes and warm embraces. Men who had mocked Daniel clapped him on the shoulder, offering sincere congratulations. "We've got fresh bread here," Mrs. Peterson called out, setting a steaming loaf on the table. "And Jenny's brought her famous apple pie." The evening air filled with the sounds of community. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of plates and forks. Children darted between the adults' legs, playing tag in the growing dusk. Lanterns were lit and hung from tree branches, casting a gentle glow over the gathering. "Kim," Miss Evans said, touching her arm, "I want you to know, your grandchildren are a blessing to my classroom. Sarah has such a gift for numbers, and Thomas, well, his reading improves every day." Kim pressed the teacher's hand gratefully. "Thank you for seeing them truly." Nearby, Henry was telling Daniel about a carpentry project that needed his skill. "Ain't nobody works wood like you do, Daniel. Reckon the new schoolhouse could use your touch." Daniel nodded, already mentally measuring lumber. "Be glad to help." Sarah and Thomas ran up, their plates piled with treats. "Mama Kim!" Sarah exclaimed, using the name she'd chosen herself. "Mrs. Wilson wants to teach me to make quilts like hers." "And Mr. Peterson says I can help with the spring planting," Thomas added proudly. Kim smoothed their hair, her heart full. These simple offers of inclusion meant more than grand gestures ever could. She caught Daniel's eye across the children's heads, seeing her own gratitude reflected there. Reverend Josiah raised his voice over the happy chaos. "Friends, let us bow our heads in thanks for this food and fellowship." The crowd grew quiet, heads bending in prayer. Daniel's arm slipped around Kim's waist as they stood with their children between them. The minister's words washed over them, speaking of redemption, of courage, of love that sees past surface to substance. "And Lord," he concluded, "we thank you especially for showing us, through this family, how to look with your eyes rather than our own." Amen? Amen. The gathering echoed firmly. As people began to disperse into the deepening twilight, carrying empty plates and warm memories, Daniel and Kim lingered by the church steps. The children played nearby with their new friends, their laughter carrying sweet and clear in the evening air. "Ready to head home?" Daniel asked softly, his hand still warm at Kim's waist. She looked up at him, this man who had stepped forward when all others stepped back. "Yes," she said simply. Home. They gathered Sarah and Thomas, accepting final hugs and handshakes from their neighbors. The family climbed into their wagon, now home to all four of them. As Daniel clucked to the horses, Kim reached for his free hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, a gesture as simple and profound as the vows they had renewed. The wagon rolled away from the church, carrying them toward their cabin in the hills. Behind them, lamplight still glowed from the windows, and the echo of hymns seemed to linger in the peaceful night air. The mountain winter settled deep around Daniel Boone's cabin, wrapping it in a pristine blanket of white. Inside, warmth radiated from the stone fireplace where logs crackled and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the hewn timber walls. The familiar scents of pine smoke and fresh-cut wood filled the cozy space. At the sturdy table he'd built with his own hands, Daniel hunched over his latest carving project. His massive fingers, surprisingly nimble, guided the knife along the grain of soft pine. Wood shavings curled away, revealing the shape of a small horse emerging from the block. Beside it lay other finished pieces: a deer, a bear standing tall, and a family of rabbits that had made Thomas laugh with delight. Kim sat in her rocking chair nearby, the gentle creaking keeping time with her quilting needle. The firelight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and her face held the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. At her feet, Sarah and Thomas sprawled on the bearskin rug, playing with the wooden figures Daniel had carved in previous evenings. "Look, Thomas," Sarah whispered, setting up the toys in careful rows. "The deer family is going to visit the rabbit family for supper." Thomas nodded seriously, arranging the pieces with solemn attention. "The bear can guard them," he decided, positioning the tall figure protectively near the others. Snow drifted against the window panes, the soft pat of flakes barely audible over the fire's steady song. The storms that had once seemed so threatening now felt like a blanket drawn close, sheltering their family from the outside world. Daniel set down his knife and reached for the Bible that rested at his elbow. The leather binding was worn smooth with use, the pages well thumbed. He cleared his throat softly, drawing the children's attention. "The Lord is my shepherd." His deep voice filled the cabin with quiet authority. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Kim's needle stilled as she listened, her eyes growing soft with memory. How far they had come from that cold day at the railway station, when jeers and mockery had threatened to break her spirit. Now each word of Scripture felt like a confirmation of God's steady hand guiding their path. "He restoreth my soul," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger with each verse. "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." The children had grown still, their toys forgotten as they listened to the familiar words. Sarah's head drooped against her grandmother's knee, her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. Thomas fought his drowsiness longer, but soon his head nodded forward onto his chest. When Daniel finished the psalm, Kim added her own quiet prayer. "Lord, we thank you for this home, for this family you've given us, for the peace that passes understanding, and for leading us through valleys to this mountaintop." "Amen," Daniel murmured, closing the Bible gently. He rose from his chair, moving with the careful quiet of a large man accustomed to handling delicate things. Bending down, he gathered Thomas in one arm and Sarah in the other, their small bodies limp with sleep. Kim watched as he carried them to their bed in the corner, tucking the quilts around them with tender precision. When he returned to the fireside, Daniel settled onto the bench beside Kim's rocker. The firelight played across his weathered features, softening the lines that hard years of solitude had carved there. His eyes held a wondering light as he watched his wife's hands move steadily with her needle. "Who'd have thought it?" he said softly, shaking his head. "A two-old bride and a mountain hermit making a real home together." Kim's hands stilled in their work. She reached over, laying her palm against his rough knuckles. "The Lord's ways aren't our ways," she reminded him gently. "His timing is perfect." Outside, a wolf's howl rose clear and wild in the winter night. Another answered, their voices twining in an ancient song. But inside the cabin, the sound held no threat. The lamplight glowed steady on the walls, and the fire burned warm and bright. Daniel turned his hand beneath Kim's, threading their fingers together. Peace settled over them like a familiar quilt, stitched from faith, endurance, and love. The trials they had faced seemed to fade into memory, replaced by the quiet certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Together, in this home they had built, with their children sleeping safely nearby. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.